Hello, my name is Bret. This is my show, and you're watching us live, hopefully on the internet. So if you didn't know, this is a live show I do every Thursday for years and years now, and it eventually turns into a podcast, which you can find links below for the podcast, and we edit it down, we take out the demos, but it's usually having guests. Like, there's usually people on the show, and you get to be live here asking questions of our guests, and we talk about DevOps and containers and everything that relates to that. So I'm excited on the show. We're going to be getting to it real quick, but in case you didn't know, this show is sponsored by you patrons. So thank you so much. We have about, we're over 100. The number changes, but you don't have to actually buy me a coffee if you just want to know what's going on with the show, what live stuff I'm doing, what blog stuff, what courses we're updating, what open source I'm creating on GitHub. For example, just click that follow button and you get like a weekly email. It's not too spammy. You just sort of get the updates on what's going on in my world of creation and talking with people on the internet. So check that out. Or if you want to buy us a coffee, we actually have a monthly hangout. So it's kind of fun. We have a Discord server right there, 10,000 people. Yay, we just passed that milestone last week, so I'm very excited about that. But you can join a monthly hangout that we have. It's just sort of like a water cooler, talking about your DevOps projects, asking for advice, maybe bringing some code. If you want people to check out your infrastructure as code and give reviews, you can totally do that. But that's on the high fivers plan, and you get also access to some other exclusive benefits. So thank you so much to my patrons. I appreciate you, and you're what keeps us going. All right, so let's get to it. On the show today, I'm very excited. I never even asked where you are in the world, but Rosemary Wang of HashiCorp.
Hi, everyone. I'm based out of the New York metro area, so East Coast, U.S.
Nice. Well, I'm down in Virginia, so not too far apart. We've got a lot of excellent tech people on the East Coast, so I don't know what it is. I get a lot of guests from the East Coast. I don't know why, but thanks for being here.
Maybe we just like talking about tech,
The
more
East Coast
people
tech.
maybe want to talk about it. Yeah, exactly. East Coast tech.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for being here. You have a book, and we're going to talk about the book today. We're going to talk about, I'm sure we're going to get into something HashiCorp at some point. We just had actually some other HashiCorp people on the show and talking about Nomad, and we're probably due for other stuff like Vault and whatnot. So maybe you can help me get some context there later. We'll talk. But you have a book, Patterns and Practices for Infrastructure as Code, and just came out this year, right?
It did. It's been an early access program since I believe last year, which has been, it's been a journey, but it is finally, I guess you could say, done. All the chapters are out. You can still find it on early access, but all the chapters are available. Hopefully we'll be in publication soon.
Nice. In print. So do you have that giant box of like printed books that you can now hand out to family and friends and like sign at conferences if you had a real one in the world?
Not yet. I'm glad I don't have it yet because I don't know if I'd have space to put it everywhere. I'm pretty sure it's a lot of books to keep around. So I'm glad I don't have it yet. But I think it's nice just to have it in its entire form, in ebook at least. So I do actually have it on my e-reader. So I like that part. Mm-hmm.
Right. Your own book right there in front of you. I have never I've never taken the challenge of writing a book because I'm too scared. I'm too scared of the process. So I applaud you. Like, well done. You finished. I think that's probably the hardest. That would be the hardest part for me. Is the start is exciting, but to actually finish it, get all the reviews back and do all the edits, that's a lot. So congrats.
Thank you.
All right. So this book, obviously, okay. So tell us a little bit about your background. You work at HashiCorp now, developer advocate, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And how did you get to HashiCorp, and how did this book even come about?
So I landed at HashiCorp because I was someone who was using the tools. And
common
theme. Common thing. You kind of like, I would say I was a big console fan, actually. Like of the tools that someone's going to be a fan of, for some reason I was a big console fan. But I had background in Terraform and in Vault. So it was a natural fit to be able to come and look at some of the tools and say, like, how do we improve? How do people use it? Why, what should we focus on? So that was a great move for me. But before that, I came from ThoughtWorks, a software consultancy. So before that, I was in financial services working on infrastructure. which is an interesting jump. Like, how do you go from infrastructure sysadmin work to ThoughtWorks, which is really well known for software development and really being thought leaders around developing software? And the answer is I was struggling to break into the industry, right? Because when you're a sysadmin or you're an infrastructure or operations person working oriented in the data center, you don't really have a good sense of what real software development is like, or really how to develop sustainable and maintainable software. And so I said,
Yeah.
I will challenge myself and learn. So there came my 4-year journey to attempt to learn to be a better software developer, and finding that I am still an awful software developer. But I know a little bit more than I did before, so that's good.
Yeah, that's really cool. We were talking a little bit about the show about like mentors, the people that we recall through our career. I've got a little gray, so I've had a few years of career, and like those people really stick with you. And I always appreciate it when I sort of find gems in awesome people that want to help and that also make you rethink all of your assumptions. So it's always a good reminder that you thought you figured it out and you haven't. So
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I think the first time I paired with, and there was nothing wrong with it, but the first time I paired with a senior Java developer, I pretty much cried because my whole, everything I thought I knew about coding and coding in a way that someone else would read it was completely blown out of the water. I was like, oh my goodness, it's like an existential crisis of sorts.
What am I even doing here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I've definitely had those moments too, especially when I like to do lunch and learns. That's kind of been like, if there's a theme of my career, it's like, okay, let's all figure out how to learn together. With my team, like let's all share our learnings with each other, make deliberate attempts to try to educate each other. And I usually, because I'm used to starting that, I'm used to sort of being in the teacher role, and then it never fails that there's someone who just comes out of nowhere that surprises me and it comes in with a lunch and learn. I'm thinking, okay, why aren't you in charge? Like, that's amazing. What you just showed us. So it's a good way to sort of find the people that are going to influence you and change your career. So who's to blame for this book? Was it your idea, or did someone say you should write a book?
I have only myself to blame, okay. Which is fair enough. But actually, a couple folks reached out to me about books over the years, and I just never felt like I had anything to contribute in terms of the book content, right? Or book as a form of media. I was always someone who favored blogs, favored doing video. I really like doing sort of short segmented code snippets because that was the way I learned, right? But it was interesting. I got some feedback from some folks I was working with, and they said, I wish you took everything that you taught me while we were pairing together over these 6 to 7 months and put it in a book, because then I could just refer back to the book instead of remembering what you told me or trying to find sound bites or trying to discover where you put this on this internal wiki. I said, that's a fair assessment. I guess that would be a reason to write the book or a book. And it turns out infrastructure as code was one of the topics that I had a lot to say. So I decided, what? When Manning reached out to me to say, hey, are you interested in writing a book about infrastructure as code? You talk a lot about it. I was like, if I'm going to talk more about a topic I already like, I might as well just write the whole book on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. And so I guess pre-COVID, you were conference talks. Have you been doing virtual conferences these last couple of years?
I have been doing virtual conferences. I find them really fun.
Yeah.
It's great. I mean, I like going to conferences and seeing people. It's fantastic. But I will say, interacting with folks in the chat, hi folks in chat, are a lot of fun. You get a lot of great commentary real time, and that's something I wasn't necessarily getting in conference in person. You got it on the hallway track, but not necessarily live as you are interacting with someone else or on the chat. So I do appreciate the virtual.
Yeah, it's a lot less hassle too. I don't have to spend thousands of dollars to fly to a place and pay to get in a building and all that. Yeah, but I never thought about that too. As you have that line of questions. Like if you have if you're lucky enough to get a topic that people are interested in, because you're always interested in your own topic, but whether other people are, it's always a question. And that line that you get at the end of the talk, where everyone's sort of asking questions of the room, it's very like one person at a time. you put on the spot, you have an answer. But yeah, the chat's way better. And of course, it was all horrible 3 years ago, but I think the virtual conferences are starting to figure it out. So maybe it doesn't suck as much. Do you have any upcoming talks? Anything that you've got in the works besides the book? Now that you've finished the book.
Yeah, so I have a talk today on demand for Conf 42 Cloud Native. It's a developer's introduction to Service Mesh. So I do stuff outside of infrastructure as code. One of those things that involves Service Mesh, but it's for if you're a developer and you're trying to understand what Service Mesh is, it's an introduction to it. There's also a couple other conferences that I have. I'll be at, unfortunately, I won't be in person at KubeCon EU, but I'll be at GitOps Days. Oh, no, that is not it. But yeah, unfortunately, it'll be somewhere in there. Yeah. Yeah, you'll find me on a lot of different things, but yeah, an upcoming one is I'll be at GitOps Days in June. So that's online as well. So folks who are interested in GitOps and secrets management, you'll get
is that the Weave conference? Is it run by? Yeah, okay. GitOps Days. I'll have to find that out. Yeah. Give people the link to that. Because we talk about GitOps a lot on this show. It's one of those topics where it's become my hammer. Everything looks like a nail for the GitOps hammer. Like I want to just GitOps everything. We end up with infrastructure people on this show that actually they're like HashiCorp. They have their own product, and I'm always sort of trying to imply on the show that you should really make that GitOps. Like that tool needs to be that tool you're having that is a great UI, but I need to have that saved to a repo somewhere in version. Can you just make that the back end of your product, please? Because I feel like we're really great at making GUI tools, and we're really great, and we're getting pretty good at making command line tools, but we're not so great at like expecting those command line tools to be automated and then to provide the automation details of how that all has to work with GitOps. And so that's a key topic around here. You can just come back on the show. We'll talk about GitOps for 60 minutes.
We should definitely talk about it, because that was actually my introduction. The reason why I ended up doing infrastructure as code in the first place was because in financial services and I guess you would say higher risk environments or highly regulated environments, you can only make changes during certain windows. And I was really tired of spending 8 hours on my weekend copying and pasting into a GUI. And at that point, I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. There has to be a better way. And that was my first sort of entrance into infrastructure as code. But the GUI was so painful because copying and pasting from a spreadsheet was not my idea of fun.
Right. Or making sure you click those things in the right order. Make sure you click this, then that, then this, then that. Yeah. So many years of that gone by. In fact, I think it's now where if that process, if that sort of, we'll label it a DevOps process, and we can discuss what DevOps is and isn't, which is a standard topic on the show as well. Like, if it's not already automated, it irks me that it's not automated. I feel like these last few years, the CI, the automation platforms have really started to mature. I'm a big GitHub Actions fan, and so I try to do that first for everything. And I feel like we're on the precipice, I feel like possibly, of a world where we're really becoming just automation experts, which I think was really one of the big goals to begin with DevOps. And we stopped focusing on a tool, and we're really more about, well, let's just automate that tool so it doesn't matter. Like maybe I'm using this tool or that tool, but does it matter if I'm automating it? It's the robots. Yeah. Does your book talk about GitOps at all? Like how do you introduce it in the book? How do you explain it to people?
Yeah, so there is a section. Some folks are like, maybe it could be a whole chapter. I was like, it's gonna get a little complicated. You could dedicate a whole book to GitOps in general, but the way I frame it is that GitOps is a much more disciplined form of infrastructure as code in a lot of ways. The key difference that I've identified with GitOps in particular is this ability to continuously deploy. And that is something, and we can talk about continuous deployment in a couple different ways, but at least after the point of you pre-testing everything, testing, et cetera, you're continuously deploying this change to reconcile drift or apply changes to infrastructure. And that part is, I think, more opinionated than what someone would say infrastructure as code is, right? So I wanted to introduce it into the book because I took such an opinionated stance on practices for infrastructure as code. For example, version control. Like, you could do infrastructure as code questionably without some form of a version control system. But to be really opinionated and to make the most of it, you do want a version control system, and every operation you do, you should be doing through version control. In general, that process, I felt like I was already so opinionated that I had to introduce GitOps as a form of sort of the extra step after that, which is the highly automated portion of it. There are some folks who disagreed, and it's fair because most of what people talk about in the GitOps space is oriented with Kubernetes, right? Because
Yeah.
Kubernetes has the controllers, they have that automated continuous deployment system or that continuous deployment controller there for you. So I do see there's like sort of this subset in between of infrastructure code and GitOps of just generally event-driven automation. So maybe you don't have a controller that perfectly monitors state and does all the reconciliation for you, but some event will maybe drive infrastructure as code, and you have that intermediate step before you go to a full GitOps model.
Yeah, I love it. I like that description around a more formal, disciplined infrastructure as code, because there's actually a question kind of related to that. Kamajaru asking, what are the prerequisites to learning or stepping into infrastructure as code? I do get this question around people sort of stepping into DevOps a lot, and they're really unsure of what they're expected to know before they can even begin.
Yeah. This is where it's kind of dependent on the platforms too. And most people who learn infrastructure as code, it's very difficult to do this without having some target platform in mind. And so usually my prerequisite is at least know one cloud provider or infrastructure provider. It helps kind of ground the practice because at least in terms of the prerequisite itself, knowing at least one will help you understand how to interact with it. It also helps to use a cloud provider because one of the main prerequisites to infrastructure as code is having an API for the infrastructure that you want to configure. Not all infrastructure has a solid API for you to use. I came from networking, right? And not all network switches have amazing APIs. So big prerequisite to choose either a cloud provider or an infrastructure provider with a really good API. And the second is find, one tool. You don't have to know programming language. I think that was the one thing that some folks mentioned to me. They're like, oh my goodness, I have to know programming languages. And the answer is probably not. There are enough infrastructure as code tools out there with domain specific languages that you don't have to know full programming. You just have to know a bit of the syntax. And so if you know those two minimal things, you can start learning the practices, right? Because infrastructure as code is not just the tools themselves. They're really about patterns and practices when you first start. So what do you do to write it? And so then you learn those, but based on those prerequisites. And then what do you do with your team? And then what do you do within your organization? So as you scale infrastructure as code, it's all of those patterns and practices you have to combine together.
Nice. I think that there's always that tough spot of people figuring out, am I good in, do I know enough to get a DevOps job, right? Because I feel like we've definitely got more people coming into DevOps roles than leaving DevOps roles. There's not a whole lot yet that we have after DevOps, which I still feel like, SREs are still following DevOps ideals. And someday I'm going to make that amazing DevOps course where there's zero tools and it's just about like patterns and practices of DevOps, and it's no code. That's I think we were talking earlier about like how do you write a book that doesn't keep having to be doesn't have to be edited. And it's like, well, don't write any code. Maybe then just ideas will last longer than the code itself. So people that are coming into that, they do have a lot of these questions around, do I need to know code is one of the most common ones. I keep telling people, like, I came from an ops background. I happen to know coding just because it was a hobby, but people weren't paying me to code. And I came into it from that ops background. And I would say it was a ClickOps background, the Windows worlds of infrastructure. And I see I see people every day that are in DevOps that they may know some coding, but they don't code on a daily basis. Like they maybe can read some code, right? They maybe can edit a line or two, but a lot of their job is not about writing tools from scratch. We do see those at talks, right? If we all go to an O'Reilly conference or a Google conference, there are going to be those amazing unicorns that are they are a developer first, now they're an ops developer, and they call themselves DevOps, but they write all their own tools in Golang, and it's amazing, but I don't think that's like the normal average person in that. And so it's good to hear you talk about, like, you don't really actually need to have all that to begin. Like, you can always be better. So in your book, when you talk about patterns, do you have some like big heavy hitters that you feel like do you have the elevator pitch tips, like hot takes on patterns?
Yeah. A lot of the ones, I think that some of the most controversial ones are the ones that are actually borrowed from software design patterns. So rather than reinvent the language around it, right? How do you think about using the existing language in software development and framing it for infrastructure as code? So I think the two most controversial chapters I think has been on the patterns between module for structuring infrastructure as code in configurations or modules, and then dependency management. So those are pretty much the interpretations from software design. So the heavy hitters are something like, how do you use a singleton? What do you think of when you use a composite? And all of these things don't really make sense if you're coming from an infrastructure space, in the infrastructure space. But if you're coming from the software space, they're terms that you may or may not be as familiar with from a design patterns view. And those are all very opinionated because not everybody, some people really want to put everything in a singleton, right? So in some infrastructure as code, you were talking about this for domain specific languages, it's easy to just put all your resources in a singleton and be done, right? But over time, it becomes very difficult to manage. So what do you think of building factories so other people can self-service subsets of infrastructure? What do you think about, dependency inversion or dependency injection for dependencies to make sure that if you're changing your network, you're not going to affect anything downstream, like your servers or your serverless functions that you've decided to run on the network. So a lot of those happen to be pretty opinionated. Those happen to be the big heavy hitters. The other two, I think 2 or 3 topics that I hear the most about: testing. I take a very opinionated set of practices and patterns on infrastructure as code testing. So for the folks who asked if testing is in the book, yes, it's in the book. I have my own opinions about how to do it. There's also some suggestions on security and compliance, also quite opinionated, and cost, which is, I would say, I think it's a controversial topic for folks because cost is really dependent on your environment. But I do have some general practices for cost, like tagging, doing things on demand, scheduling, auto scaling, etc. So there's some recommendations there.
Yeah, it's funny, the costing topic, I feel like in a lot of, especially in large organizations, I feel like it's a very advanced topic. That you don't see people early on, younger infrastructure teams or younger DevOps teams. Cost, it's just it's a number with, it's opaque. You can't see, you just know this is how much we cost. Like, sorry, we made all your stuff work. That's what it costs to make it work. And I only find, most of the teams I work with, that's kind of how they approach budgeting, and they don't look at infrastructure as a way to bring visibility to what our cost is and where all of our costs are. And of course, I need to have an entire show on that. Probably bring on the Duckbill group, someone who really focuses on cost in AWS. But I love that you talked, let me go back to something earlier. You talked about pick a cloud and learn it. And it is one of the sort of the staples that I talk a lot about with when I'm advising teams is you can't automate what you don't know yet how to do. So you really don't come into the DevOps automation world without having the understanding of what it was like before then. It's almost like you need to do this the hard way before you can automate it. And I do see people that come into teams a lot. They're new to the team. The team is not new. They are new to DevOps in general and infrastructure, managing infrastructure. And then they struggle because they immediately are thrown into a world that's fully automated, already GitOpsed, and they don't yet know the APIs. They don't yet know the infrastructure itself. Is this just a learning process, or is there something do you know if there's something we can do in the teams to help the sort of the new DevOps person on board? Is that something you've had to deal with in your past?
Yeah, so team norming is a is a big part of actually making an infrastructure team work really well. But also, you have to. So there's a balance to this, right? Having good documentation, and as much as we'd like to say code is the documentation, the reality is nothing beats documentation of certain larger, higher level processes that you might have. So If you have specific processes around change management, which yes, we all complain because it's a manual step and a manual approval.
Yeah.
But the reality is we still have some of those for production, right? Outlining what that process is, what is the definition of, outlining what a definition of good is, right? Is super helpful. Pairing with that person. And I think most important is investing in either course or separate learning for that person on a target platform, on a cloud provider. It's it's tough when you don't have even the right terms or the right information to do your best when you're trying to make changes to infrastructure platforms or even code, applications in general. You don't want to bring down something, but in order to do that, you need to have some kind of foundational knowledge. So early investment into giving someone the opportunity to go to courses, take a course or find some kind of learning outside of their day-to-day is very helpful. For me, the very first thing that helped me when I was going into networking was my manager sent me to a CCNA course. Did I take the exam? No. But CCNA is the Cisco networking exam. But it was a good way to just be like, okay, you're dedicating 2 weeks as a crash course to understanding what basic networking is, how you're going to configure a switch, what you're going to do. So that way, when you come in, you at least have a base level knowledge. You know what the terms are. You understand how to configure it. And I think that was a really great investment from the company's side. It went a lot faster after that because I knew what to do. And so making that early investment is great. Short of that, pairing has been fantastic. And documentation. I think those are the two main ones.
Nothing, there's few things that make me sadder than someone pulling up a repo in GitHub or Bitbucket and then the README is blank. But that happens so much in I feel like in enterprise IT especially, where they're moving, they all have the wikis and the SharePoints and all these other things, confluences, and but then they make they work. I feel like this is a big anti-pattern that I want to soapbox for a moment, because we create documentation elsewhere, but we don't enable people in the tool they work in, the tool they live in, which is nowadays the place you're storing your code. And they're adding infrastructure repos, they're doing all this stuff, and then there's all these blank readmes. Or the readmes is incredibly, it only would make sense to the people in the team, no one out of the team. You see this trend? Yeah. This empty
I
readme
see
trend?
It a lot. Yeah. I see it a lot, and it's frustrating because it's anybody who's looking for information, you want it close to the code. First of all, if you're the person updating the information, you're never going to update something that's outside of the code, right? It's like almost the extra step of going to a Confluence or internal wiki and updating it separately. Keeping it close to the code incentivizes you to update it. It also helps you if you decide to automate some of it, because maybe you need to document inputs, outputs, or something specific. At least you can automate it next to the code. You're not subject to some other API or some other external service that you have to update after that. But the other frustrating thing is, like, I see a lot of people who will come to sometimes even demos, and I will acknowledge I'm not perfect. I was like this in my early developer advocate days too, where the README was pretty vague. Someone couldn't really run through it themselves. And over time, what was actually kind of karma was that I would come back to my own demo because I need to reuse it for something, and I didn't even know how to run it. That was the point in time where I realized that if you put all the information someone needs, the dependencies, as much clear information as you can about how you run it, you yourself will come back to your own code and be able to run it successfully in less time than, let's say, reverse engineering it for 3 days. So I learned that lesson the hard way. So highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you work in this field long enough, you're definitely going to run into your stuff later that you wrote that you don't remember writing. I don't know how long it takes. There's probably someone's law around how long does it take in your career before you find code, you're looking at it and going, what is this? And you realize, oh, this is me. And it might just be on the internet, some random place if you're lucky, and you write something that's open source. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one seeing that trend, and I love the idea of keeping it close to the code, because it does take. I feel like it's also top-down leadership, like respecting documentation as much as the code or the infrastructure as code itself. And this last couple of years, I've been on a journey to get everyone linting, automated linting on every commit. And I don't know if you've seen these new tools, Super Linter, Mega Linter. They're like bundling all the linters, and I'm on this like roadshow of the internet of let me see if we can lint that for you automatically, and then eventually enforce that as part of the PR process, and so they can't just ignore linting. But we don't yet have one that says, okay, your number of documentation lines in Markdown in this to code, you have 10,000 lines of code, and you have 50 lines of Markdown and comments, your ratio is off, and we will fail this PR. Like, I haven't seen that yet, but I feel like there's something around that idea that needs to happen. I don't know if you have influence at maybe one of these great software companies that makes good open source, but like something that could just tell us, hey, look, your documentation is kind of sucking on this PR. Like, instead of someone having to manually review, and then we don't all like to critique each other always. So I sometimes see resistance in teams where people don't want to pressure someone to do better documentation or more documentation. But I don't know if you've seen anything like that. Maybe it already exists.
Yeah. It's like code quality, but for documentation almost, It's like, or what is the test coverage, right? Test coverage metrics for documentation. Right. That'd be kind of nice. No one's done that. I will say, like, so one of the nice parts, and this is just, it's because it is one of the things that's top of my head, and it's so convenient, and I just really liked it. But when you do something in Terraform, for example, and you bring this module to the Terraform registry, it actually does automatic documentation for you. Mm-hmm. So it pulls in whatever README, so you can add your extra information about what you want that module to do, but it automatically documents inputs, outputs, which I'm like, more auto documentation, please. Like, if that's possible. For well-established things, like even linting, right? If there was a way that you could take those linting rules and express it, before you, as you pointed out, express what kind of documentation you need, knowing the standard of the kind of code that you have to write, that would be super helpful. I guess that's where Swagger, right, is supposed to, Open API specs, Swagger docs, we're supposed to help with APIs, for example.
Well, and I feel like we're not too far from that. I haven't really seen much of the automation of that yet, but I mean, I do have CodePilot turned on. Copilot. I always want to call it CodePilot. I feel like they could have had a better name. Copilot. We're talking about GitHub. I'm talking about GitHub Copilot, which is an AI generation engine essentially, and I use it. I was the first one that. I was trying to be one of the first people that would misuse it for DevOps and say, like, what if I wrote the entire Markdown file one line at a time from a robot, and it actually is not horrible. Like, I find myself writing more documentation. Because every time, I don't know if you've done this with VS Code yet, but if you're in VS Code and you have Copilot turned on and you're in Markdown or you're in a comment and you hit return, it wants to give you more text. So it will suggest a line that may be total BS, or it might be genius, and you're like, yes, I should put that in here. Hit tab, it's done. I now look better with my documentation, even though I didn't write it. So I feel like we're accidentally there, maybe, but you're right. We could have some bots that are saying, would you like this documentation that I just made for you? Would you like me to add this to your PR? That would be great.
Yeah, that would be really nice.
I think we all need more bots that help keep us on the rails a little bit. Exactly. So I know that your book is not focused on tools necessarily. It does, and the titles say Python and Terraform. But I have some questions here. Self-development is asking a question: what made you write about it, and what differs from your book from other infrastructure as code books? So, the competition question: how are you to the competition?
So I wrote it because I was inspired by a lot of folks that I was working with, and they were like, we want to hear this, or we want to come back and reference it. And at some point I would be talking to them in a meeting, and I would have these like great trains of thoughts. And I'm like, wow, I should write it down. And I never did. And then I forgot about them. And so synthesizing this and aggregating it all into a book has been really helpful, because I'll go back and reference how I've synthesized it. It's forced me to think about these ideas more cohesively and tell a story about it, right? So In terms of what differs, there are a number of IaC books out there and they're fantastic. You can use them to cross-reference as well as get a better sense of other perspectives in IaC. A lot of IaC books are tool specific. So if you're using something like CloudFormation or Terraform or something else, they're books that are focused on that tool. So it will teach you from getting started all the way to how do you think about applying it across an organization. I didn't really want to make a tool specific book because tools change, but also a lot of the times these patterns and practices I found myself doing across a lot of tools. So I show the examples in Python predominantly, rendering back to Terraform actually for so you can run them yourself and create these resources and actually do this live if you wanted to. But they are really patterns oriented. They're not as much tools like Terraform's. Now, there is another book that is actually infrastructure as code patterns, sort of infrastructure as code patterns approach. Shout out to Keith Morris. The first edition was predominantly about server configuration. Fantastic book. It helped me understand how to configure servers, how to think about infrastructure as code in the configuration management space. The second edition does reiterate over infrastructure as code, does talk about patterns, and does talk about a couple different opinionated approaches. So overall, the main difference about this book was that I took what I learned end to end from a practical view and tried to bring it up to a more theoretical approach. And so the result is that you're getting something all the way from you started writing infrastructure as code, you started using it, but then what do you do after that? So we go all the way to how you deal with failure and rolling forward. How do you think about continuous delivery or deployment, which is a pretty controversial topic in infrastructure as code in general. Yeah. It's a very widely disagreed upon and discussed topic in general, no matter where it is. But and then all the way into cost, which I think is a pretty unique chapter, but I felt like it was worth including because there are a lot of ways that you can mitigate or manage costs through infrastructure as code. And we don't really talk about that very clearly.
Yeah. I feel like there's as much like everything else. I feel like the more I learn about infrastructure as code, and not just necessarily the tools, like you're talking about, like the patterns, the different approaches teams take, because there's like so much variety, and it's rare for me to see two teams that do anything in the automation and DevOps space the same. So we have major themes. I feel like we all kind of generally agree. But when it comes to implementation or to team-specific workflows, it gets highly culture unique. And to see more of these examples, I think is only, you can't just read one of these books and get everything you're going to need for even how your team might need to do it. Because I think people are always wanting very specific patterns and implementations so that they can just do it and be done. But the reality is that I see with DevOps teams that are really focused on automation, like the things you do today are the things you're going to keep. You're just repeating and rinse and repeating all of these patterns and these practices. The tool might change. I might not be using Jenkins anymore. I might be using GitHub Actions or, Confluence, or not the Confluence, another automation tool. Azure DevOps, whatever the buzzwords are of the day. But the principles are still staying the same. I feel like the change for me and the people that I consult with really for the last decade has been that the tools might have changed slightly, but it's more of, we have now all approached this from an automation first. And so if I filled my 40-hour week with a bunch of clicky, type these things over and over again, and that whole idea of the word toil, I feel like that's really, like, that's the thing that I feel like has been beat into a lot of us. It's like, if detect toil early and find a way to avoid it. Do you talk about that at all in the book? I mean, this kind of gets a little bit more into SRE, because I sometimes find that people don't quite understand how to know when they should be doing something themselves, and when you and I might walk into a room and go, "Why are you doing that manually?" And because we clearly see it, right? But they maybe don't.
Yeah, I talk about it in the beginning in terms of benefits, right? Because one of the things that you don't realize when you're configuring something manually is that there's actually a cost to it over time. It may seem like a very you don't expend too much time or energy to start, right? Maybe you're like, let me just do one or two things manually. Great. But it adds up over time, because if something goes wrong, thanks to the manual change, you actually spend a lot more time debugging, resolving, troubleshooting, reverse engineering, and bringing back the system because of that. So I don't have the chart on me, unfortunately, but there's a chart that I have that, there's like an initial effort, and then you'll watch it kind of go really high, right? Over time, if there's something disastrous that's happened, right? So it's not all the time that there is something worst case scenario that happens in automation, or in lack of automation. But there are the times in which something goes horribly awry and you end up spending 3 weeks trying to recover a system because of it. Because of maybe a manual change that you didn't either completely document, or you have to do really large scale changes across a huge amount of your infrastructure footprint, for example. And then, you compare that to infrastructure as code or automation in general, you're going to have an initial investment in terms of time and effort. There's no way around it. You're going to spend a little bit more time doing some initial work to automate and to reproduce it, to test it, to make sure it's stable. But over time, as you repeat that automation, that effort decreases, right? And if something does go horribly awry, you at least have this, hopefully, you've followed a bit of the principle of immutability, and you're able to recreate the infrastructure or the resources that you need with lower effort. So that's where I think the struggle is. A lot of people ask about, what about manual? Sometimes you can't avoid a manual change,
right?
But when you can, invest in the initial automation effort, and surprisingly, over time, the effort continues to decrease.
Yeah, you actually brought up a good point there. Slightly different conversation around those of us that come from ops backgrounds. Like the last few decades has been mostly about backup and restore, and less about recreate. Like less focus on recreate, and I almost feel like that's another T-shirt idea. Is like DevOps is recreate, not restore. Obviously, you have persistent data, and that has to be restored because it's unique. But for so much of our jobs, those people that are on the infrastructure side of this conversation, so much of our jobs is largely about creating things that should be recreatable, and that recreation should be automated. But we've been so tied to tools, like you said, that don't have APIs, the infrastructure in the data center that has to, that the the APIs are really just a shell. You get a shell, or you get some sort of remote PowerShell port on Windows or something, and you struggle with that because you've been classically trained to think about, okay, I created something, now I'm going to back it up so that I can restore it when it goes bad, rather than there's nothing in here I can't recreate from infrastructure as code, or from automated tooling, or from manual tooling. There's nothing I can't recreate, and that's going to be our method rather than restore. Because that's a hard habit really to change, I think, in your head, is to say, okay, what if I didn't have a way to back up and restore? Like, just imagine a world without backup tools. Almost like tying people's hands to say, you can't, you're not going to be able to restore this. You're going to have to recreate it from something else.
Yeah, exactly. It's surprisingly a lot of disaster, sort of like the worst case disaster scenario, right? You cannot just back up and restore, because maybe your backup's corrupt and you just can't do it anymore. Like there's no way you can't really resolve that, right? The only possibility that you can do is recreate it. And when you don't have the practice of recreating, you often create an environment that is either non-performant or still doesn't work. So, the recreation's like practice. You're just consistently practicing the creation of infrastructure all the time. So it works to folks who, even in the worst case scenario, they can't restore the backup because something has gone really, really wrong. At least they're able to recreate some portion of the infrastructure or some portion of the system and allow users to continue to use it.
Yeah. Very cool. I have a very specific question from the chat. Hopefully you have the answer. Sorry. Terraform Cloud versus Terraform.
Sure. So Terraform has open source, and then there's Terraform Cloud. So Terraform open source, you can download to your laptop, run, create some Terraform configuration files to build your infrastructure, run Terraform apply, and it creates your infrastructure. But that doesn't really scale across your team members. It doesn't necessarily scale across your organization. Oftentimes, when you start using Terraform open source and you need to share it, uh, as with the IaC, the infrastructure as code practices and
Right.
patterns that you would typically want to communicate and enable to the rest of your team, it doesn't work to do it locally, right? It's this joke of like, it works locally on my laptop, but it doesn't work, with someone else running it. You encounter conflicts in infrastructure changes, etc. So the idea is that there's a paid offering called Terraform Cloud. It is a cloud offering. What this does is that it helps you collaborate with your team. So you can connect something like a Terraform Cloud workspace to version control. And what that will do is anytime you push to version control, anyone, in fact, pushes to that repository, Terraform Cloud will run and apply the changes to Terraform. So you can think of it as partly a build system, focused specifically on Terraform, running Terraform,
Right.
making sure that you can collaborate on it across multiple people and different parts of your organization.
Yeah. So it's almost like Terraform plus plus.
Yes, Terraform plus plus.
Yeah.
Now it's not to say you can't build something like a pipeline and get a workflow in GitHub Actions
Mm-hmm.
and achieve a similar workflow, right? You can do that, but a lot of people don't necessarily want to out of the box. They want to just be able to turn on, Terraform Cloud and just run Terraform and then share it with their team. That's
Right.
really all they want.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
When they maybe don't have an existing automation platform that they could build all this functionality in. Plus, I mean, personally, I use Terraform Cloud, and the GUI is very hyper focused on the typical Terraform workflow, as opposed to something you might do in GitHub Actions, which it's nice because it's centralized automation, but it's very generic. So it's going to be harder for you to put highlight the important information about that particular stuff. I mean, I think even at GitHub Universe conference, Hashi shows up and someone's doing a demo on Terraform in GitHub Actions or something like that. But I think you could even do that stuff a little bit with Terraform Cloud in a way, or having Terraform Cloud coming back into GitHub PRs or something like that. But I do like Cloud. So for those of you asking, like Karamaju, check it out because I think it does have like a free tier. I feel like
It is. Yeah. So you get remote runs. You get an organization with remote runs, right? So they run one at a time, but per workspace. But you get it. You can just get it for free. You get remote state, for example. So part of the trick with Terraform is that you can do something called local state, which means no one knows what kind of infrastructure you've spun up.
Right.
So the idea is that you want to share
ops.
state.
Yeah,
Exactly. You want to share state. So what it will do is give you remote state. It will also give you the remote runs as well. So you can run them one at a time. You can't run them in parallel unless you're on the paid tier, but the free tier you can pretty much, and up to 5 people. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Any other questions in the chat? All right. Oh yeah. Someone's saying, yeah, up to 5 people. So we have some fans in the crowd.
Yeah.
All right, so we know GitOps Days is coming up. You're doing something there. Someone did ask in chat if we knew about any other DevOps events coming up. Docker's conference and KubeCon are not technically DevOps focused, but there will be plenty of DevOps-y kind of stuff. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna be at DockerCon having a chat about Node.js in Docker. So for those of you on here, that's a couple of weeks away. Let me just show that. Because it's on the internet, there's always things going on every week, probably in this space. So that's DockerCon. Obviously, KubeCon is coming up. I don't know, what week is that? KubeCon EU.
That's May something, mid-May, I want to say. I think it's mid-May.
They're probably back to back. There we go. Yeah, May. Yeah. Good call. And then, and let's see, June. Okay, so then we have Weaveworks in June with GitOps Days. So that there will be more videos between those 3 conferences that I can watch for the rest of my life. Like if I decided to watch one of those videos a week, I think it would take me 10 years to just on these 3 events alone. So DockerCon first, that's free. Everybody show up. KubeCon. You can watch the keynotes for free. I still think they charge a little bit for the online online attendance, not much. And I believe GitOps Days is free.
I believe so too. Yeah.
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 All right. Well, if no one else has any other questions for Rosemary, how do they get the book? I sent them the link. They can buy it where books are sold? I think that's the thing to say nowadays. You can buy the book where books are sold.
Exactly. It's on Manning right now, but eventually on its publication date, it will be wherever books are sold. So for now, as long as it is through the early access program and predating the publication date, which I believe someone mentioned was July 2022, you will have to get it through Manning, but then after that, you can get it through any book.
Oh, okay. So it's probably, I'm going to guess they got it like on Amazon and pre-order it or something like that. Or yeah. Very exciting. Well, congrats on that. I can only imagine the level of effort. I feel like there's never any end. You just have to decide someday that you're done. Like there's never, like, when can you stop? There's no limit.
No,
especially when it's an ebook.
I realized 2 days ago that I forgot something in the book, and I was like, well, I guess it's not the most critical thing, but like it would be kind of nice if I had it. I was like, nope, too late. I can't. I have to just stop at that point. But it was about code coverage, test coverage, actually. So that was.
Yeah, so I mean that second edition, right? That's what I was talking to you about before the show. When's the second edition coming out? You haven't even shipped the first edition yet.
I know.
So
I know.
Yeah, and Eric's mentioning some DevOps Days, by the way, for those of you just joining. If you're not aware of DevOps Days, those are local conferences, and everyone's got amazing logos. I'm very jealous, but we just had ours recently down in North Carolina, in Raleigh, and I sadly missed it due to having conflicts with other stuff going on. So you can check these events out locally at your area. So DevOpsDays.org. That's another one you can do. And yeah, and so buy the book where books are sold. I think I'm trying to remember that's I've been listening to a lot of other podcasts lately and authors, and that's what they always say. Buy it at your favorite bookstore. Bookstore. Exactly. Are we still calling them bookstores? I don't know that there's any. Maybe a Barnes and Noble somewhere.
I have a local one near me that I really like. Now, if you want any tech books, you have to like tell them very specifically, and they'll have to order it for you. But there are some local bookstores still around, so I guess the statement still applies.
Yeah, or your local library, which does have books. They do have books. They maybe don't buy every tech book that comes out, but they probably have like TCP IP Unleashed Edition, 2 from 1998, and you could read that because that's probably the book I learned TCP on, and so. And by the way, your tip on CCNA, I just want to thank you. I honestly feel like there is a staple, like we all, like certifications are a thing, and yeah, they're not always the most perfect thing. They don't solve all the problems, obviously. But I feel like that, like learning one cloud, like you talked about that, I feel like that's a very good theme, and that's something that I do recommend to people. Like just pick one. Pick the one that either your job currently uses or the job you're aspiring for might use. If you don't have any opinions, adopt AWS by default, just because that's higher percentage chance that you'll end up using it. But you do that, and I feel like this. I started my career in the 90s, as a sysadmin, and then I got to do networking for a few years on a large medical company. So I went and did that. I did the CCNA. I didn't go down the whole rabbit hole of CCIE and like becoming legendary status or anything. But I did that very same thing you did, and I feel like that set my career up so well. I mean, almost like a basic software development course, any course, a cloud course, and then a networking course that gets me to CCNA. I feel like those are like the recipe for a healthy DevOps engineer and career. I feel like, so I'm glad you mentioned that because I don't mention it enough.
Yeah, it's I would say it was unique. I wouldn't have thought about it. I mean, I was interested in networking, but I wouldn't have thought about it in that depth. But it's come in handy a lot more than I thought. Like I never thought that I'd be sitting on a Kubernetes cluster and debugging MTU jumbo frames. Never thought that. And if it wasn't for having some networking knowledge and understanding MTU frame size, I feel like I probably would have sat there like spinning my wheels, trying to figure out what was going on. Yeah. And or never figured it out. Right. And it's come in handy more than I care to admit. And I highly recommend even if not a CCNA, choose something that is network oriented. Choose a networking course, right? At the very least. Right,
a Network Plus or some sort of, maybe not certification focused, but definitely how does networking work? And I mean, hopefully we've all at this point, everyone watching in some level of IT has all had to do that TCP/IP subnetting and IP4. Like, so at some point in your career, I feel like that was a part of everyone's, like, whether it was college or Microsoft certifications or whatever they're doing. Like, somehow, somewhere, there's that. But I feel like that larger thing of understanding, like you're saying, packet size, when we get into containers, we learn about VETs and like virtual Ethernet interfaces, and that wasn't a thing for containers. That wasn't new. We actually all knew about that before. It's just way more popular now. And I feel like those fundamentals that you had and I got, like, they've served me, I think, more than honestly anything else in my career. Because OS has changed, software development languages change. We get new languages, we get new tools. But TCP/IP, I mean, basically the IP world really doesn't change that often. And when it does, it's extremely slow and frustrating. Like 20 years ago when we were all saying, IPv6, it's the future. And still many of us, especially in the Western worlds, are not on IPv6. I got IP6 at home now. I'm so excited. I feel like my internet's all new because I finally got it this year. So
you're so I've not made the switch. I'm still stuck on IPv4. I'm just like, you know what? We're sticking with it. We're sticking with it. You know?
It works. It was a really good idea in the 70s and 80s. Like, that's amazing that still works.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm sure we could chat forever on any one of these topics. We could have you back, but we do have to end at some point. So thank you all for the chat and for Eric's constant commentary about. He said, I'm recommending your book for our Kubernetes Container Book Club. And
there's
of course,
a little bit of Kubernetes in there. I will say little tiny bit. So, but it is very much infrastructure oriented. So just as a word of warning, there's not too much on containers in there, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and that's good because the containers is just the newest idea, it's the latest idea, and you want that book to not be completely outdated in 3 years, right? So you got to do something. You got to leave something on the cutting room floor, as they say. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to meet you, and good luck with the book. We will definitely be talking about that in the podcast. For those of you watching, this does turn into a podcast. If you missed the rest of the show because you're a YouTuber and everyone only stays for 5 minutes, except for all you true fans who hung out the whole hour, I appreciate you. So you can check out this thing live or watch the re-recording, or you can listen to the podcast that comes out probably in a month or so, wherever podcasts. In your favorite podcast player, as they say. And Rosemary will tell you all about DevOps and infrastructure as code. So I'm so glad we had this conversation. It was great. For those of you, we'll see you next week. We're live every Thursday. Coming up, we've got other guests in May. I have a list. I'm not going to go through the whole list. You're just going to have to get on the Patreon to find out, or subscribe to this channel and hopefully get alerts. So we'll see you again. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.